All right, there we go. So we have self-magnetization. So Jonathan and I came up with the idea from the Aquarian Almanac, and this weekend on the 18th, self-magnetization is the theme. And we designed this, a couple of us designed this nice little flyer with a Zen Buddhist monk there meditating. And magnetization is indeed a kind of a meditational work that is talked about in the Gita. So one of the articles, in fact, actually it's the main article, is a March 1981 article in the Hermes magazine by Raghavan Iyer entitled Self-Magnetization. And he says, a quote that's in the calendar book is, by the power of thought, one can enable one can enable what is in the higher vestures to act magnetically upon the lower vestures. And that's from the Aquarian Almanac for today. And at the beginning of the Raghavan Iyer article, there's this quote, which I'll go ahead and read. It's in typical HPB kind of complex language, but it will be part of what Raghavan Iyer talks about in the article, and part of what I'll be dissecting today in some way, shape, or form. So here we go. Thus proceeds, and let me see, my pictures are covering. Oh yeah, it's from Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, page 267, 268. So it reads as follows. Thus proceed the cycles of the septenary evolution in septennial nature. The spiritual or divine, the psychic or semi-divine, the intellectual, the passional, the instinctual or cognitional, the semi-corporeal, and the purely material or physical natures. All these evolve and progress cyclically, passing from one into another in a double centrifugal and centripetal way, one in their ultimate essence, seven in their aspects. Thus far, for individual, human, sentient, animal, and vegetable life, each the microcosm of its higher macrocosm. The same for the universe, which manifests periodically for purposes of the collective progress of the countless lives, the outbreathings of the one life, in order that, through the ever-becoming, every cosmic atom in this infinite universe, passing from the formless and the intangible through the mixed natures of the semi-terrestrial down to matter in full generation, and then back again, reascending. So we got the descending, reascending at each new period, higher and nearer the final goal, that each atom, we say, may reach through individual merits the effort, that plane where it re-becomes the one unconditioned all. So just to go back to the septenary nature here, I just typed these in. I was trying to make a scan, but my scanner didn't work. So we have the septenary nature, the upper and lower vestures. The upper triad is the Atma, Buddhi, Manas. And Manas is curious enough. It has two aspects, the Buddhi Manas, the higher Manas, and then the lower Kama Manas. The Prana, the Linga Sharira, the astral, and the Shula Sharira, or the physical. So those are the seven natures. And as Blavatsky's quote says, we have this journey upward and downward. And fascinatingly enough, a couple of weeks or a month or so ago, Gene Jennings gave a talk on Pistis Sophia and talked about that upper travel and the lower travel. And it's interesting that in the quote, Blavatsky uses words like centripetal and centrifugal, meaning to go towards the middle and to go away from the middle, and then talks about a kind of a helical, a mixture of this path. So it's a complex path, but yet it does have a cyclical nature of it, touching heaven and earth, you might say. One thing I wanted to focus on from the Gita in chapter 6, and a lot of this self-magnetization, like that Zen Buddhist monk at the beginning, is about meditation and meditational practices. And in this chapter 6 of the Gita, our hero Arjuna is talking to Krishna about, well, how can I do this? And Krishna is saying meditation is the way to go, and to find all this equanimity and this balance, and to renounce connections and expectations about things you do in the world, a theme that gets repeated in different ways in the Gita. Now, really going down to the specifics, I'm not going to attempt to read the Sanskrit transcription there at the top, but this 11 here, it's not a 2, it's an 11, is the William Quan Judge translation of verse 11 in chapter 6. He should, in an undefiled spot, place his seat firm, neither too high nor too low, and made of kusa grass, which is covered with a skin and a cloth. And then the footnote for that says, these instructions are for the hermits who have retired from the world. And many translators have variously construed the text. One reads that the devotee has only skin and a sheet to cover himself and to lie on the grass. Another says that his goods or his clothing are made of cloth and a deer skin and kusa grass. And those who know say that this is a description of a magnetically arranged seat, that the kusa grass is laid on the ground, the skin on the grass, and the cloth on the skin. And this philological or linguistic discussion will never decide which is the real thing. And then here are two other quotations, one by CGP. Having established a firm seat in a clean spot, neither too high nor too low, covered with a cloth, a skin, and kusa grass. So very simple. And then the Janeshwar quote is, for practicing yoga, one should find a quiet, attractive place from where one would be reluctant to get up and where the feeling of renunciation would grow. And indeed, this quiet, attractive place is an important thing for your meditational practices. And Jonathan and I were texting and messaging about a word called abhyasa. Let me see if I'm saying that correctly, which is practice. And Patanjali says this abhyasa practice is one thing that one would do with persistence over time and consistently, and that would really help in this self-magnetization to get you on that obligatory pilgrimage and really unite your lower self with the higher self. So of course here in chapter 6, Arjuna is complaining that it's hard to do this, and Krishna gives him various, rejoinders about how, you can do it if you hold on to renounce thoughts and renounce your expectations about the action. So that renunciation is a big thing. And really to have an emotional equanimity in your relationships to things in the world regarding, winning the lottery, getting married, getting divorced, getting a car accident, all of these different things that transpire in the movie, the theater show that is our life here in the physical world, and to have that equanimity. One of the other quotes in the article and in some surrounding articles talks about being clean, and so in addition to the clean place with the kusa grass and the animal pelts, another aspect is to clean yourself. And curiously, over the years, people have been using spas and different mineral baths. And this is a fascinating thing. And let me see here. Okay, here it is. Here's a nice quote. Let me read this. The ancients gave great importance to electricity in its relation to self-purification through self-magnetization. This has to do not merely with physical hygiene, but with all modes of pollution and cleanliness affecting the body, the brain, and the heart. Many people instinctively feel a wish to bathe after various kinds of debasing encounters. But one cannot produce a metaphysically and karmically purifying result through physical means alone. Nevertheless, if the abstract is made the basis of the external through meditation, then spiritual knowledge and devotion can purify one's nature from within, without, from above, below. And that's about the fires of creation from Hermes magazine. And let me see. Okay, here we go. Another thing on the mineral baths, and this kind of touches on my professional life of psychiatry. After my science life, I did the psychiatry life. And here's some interesting little articles. Professor Brown from a university here in the US, and I think it's Brown University, so the name is doubled up here. So the ancient Greeks, probably the Romans, and also Native Americans bathed in mineral waters, probably containing lithium. And those naturally occurring lithium salts found their way into the groundwater, and they'd be especially present in mineral springs. And why that's doubled, I don't know. There's one guy in psychiatry that's very famous, Dr. Cage. He's an Australian physician, psychiatrist. He used lithium salts for bipolar disorder in the 1940s. And interestingly enough, lithium is a big part of granite here on Earth. It's one of three different kinds of atoms, the helium, hydrogen, lithium at the beginning of the universe. And some astronomers and cosmologists postulate that the universe, this version of manifestation in that cyclical pralaya manvantara, this time we're going for 13.8 billion years of the day of Brahman. And so we have that cyclical nature that opening Blavatsky quote talks about. And here are those three elements. Somehow the beginning words periodic table got cut off. But at the beginning of the universe, we have hydrogen mostly, but then there's also helium and then lithium. Now, curiously, the atomic mass of lithium is close to 7. And in the early 1900s, because of all this spas and baths all over the world, and European ones were popular, but also in Australia, they had these mineral baths. It was noticed that people who went to these spas would calm down. So this is a kind of a, you might say, chemically induced equanimity, where they're not so worried about good things and bad things happening in their life, and they get that equanimity and that detachment that chapter 6 of the Gita talks about. So they decided, well, let's take this lithium and put it in a drink. Because the mass is close to 7, the drink was called 7-Up, because it would give you a kind of a good mood if you were grumpy. And of course, in the early 1930s and 40s, the FDA made them take the lithium out of 7-Up. So nowadays we don't have lithium in our 7-Up, but in the early days it did have lithium in it. And then this John Cage fellow, this psychiatrist, here's a picture of him, Dr. Cage, began using lithium for, this was a huge innovation in psychiatry, using lithium, he's got a little pill here of lithium carbonate in the treatment of bipolar disorder, that mania, and it would calm down the abnormal giddy elation that someone might have and the rageful anger. So you might say again, this is a chemically induced renunciation of your reactions and expectations about the world around you. So it's kind of fascinating how that can happen. Let me turn here towards magnets. Now maybe as kids you might have played with iron filings, and let me go back a picture here. Okay, so where's iron? So here's iron in the periodic table of elements in row 17. It's this red one here. Oxygen is right next to it. Iron and oxygen, we'll talk about those later. But so these little metal things are iron here, and what they're tracing out around this magnet that has the blue and the red is the magnetic lines of force that occur around a magnet. And then here you see some little compasses which are showing, which way north is going compared to the fields. And in our planet Earth, there's a magnetic field of the planet, believe it or not. And we'll get to that in a minute. And so compasses will go to magnetic north, which is ever so slightly different than true north, or the north of the axis of rotation of the planet. But there's these curiosities about how our planet is revolving on its axis, and then it's revolving around the sun, but then there's also a magnetic field of our planet Earth. And these other pictures on the side show what happens when you put the two norths together. The field cancels itself out, so there is no field there. There's a kind of a repulsive force. And then here when you have the opposite poles, north and south, together on two different magnets, there's a connection. And you see these magnetic lines of force. Now let me see if I could show this YouTube. Now earlier today I couldn't get the sound to show, but let me go back to sharing, and I'll just share this video, 1 or 2 minutes. It's a 2-minute long video. Okay, so what you're seeing here, hopefully, is some kind of a movement, and this.
Sorry.
Do you see it?
No.
Oh, no.
It's not sharing right now.
Oh, yeah.
Didn't share yet.
Yeah, now I have to hit the share button. So let me go back to the beginning. So this is a computer diagram here of the sun and the magnetic
sun
fields.
Is a beautifully
So just
magnetically
like those,
driven.
just like those lines on the magnets, our sun has magnetic fields, and some of them come out of the surface of the sun and go right back. Others, like these yellow ones, they kind of loop up and down to the sun in bigger ones. The red ones seem to go out in really huge long distances, but you can see there's a lot of magnetic activity in the sun. And curiously, in Theosophy we talk about this obligatory pilgrimage, and after a period after life in the devachanic state, then we make a travel through different planets, one of which is the sun. And this is a fascinating example of the kind of movement and fluidity and activity of the sun. Let me go ahead and stop that. It's not totally understood what causes the magnetic fields on the sun. Some think it's movement in deep inside the sun, others think it's movement of the magma of the sun close to the surface. But there is a magnetic action of the sun. Now let me come back to my keynote here. Alrighty, and I'll go back to the play mode. So that's the sun's magnetic field. And the other big planet important to us is our Earth. And here you can see it here, this red dashed line, and these yellow lines are the Earth's magnetic field. Now, it's not symmetrical because the sun, here you see this over here, the solar wind, the sun has these charged particles that are emanating from the sun in addition to light, and they kind of push our field around, our Earth's magnetic field. And at the north here, you can see where the line kind of goes together, and somehow this is not symmetrical, but down here at the south, you get the charged particles coming through the Earth's atmosphere, and you see those beautiful aurora borealis, so you have those lights. And light is an important part of this whole conversation and presentation as well. So what about light and electromagnetism? Let me just flash this up here for a moment here, not go into a lot of detail about this, but in the 1800s, and actually for centuries, people knew about magnetism and static electricity, but didn't totally understand it. And then earlier in the 1800s, we got electric lights and that sort of thing. Edison perfected the filament in the light bulb. He did not really invent the light bulb, but running electricity through a filament, it would warm it up and glow. So people had been using electricity for a while. And there's this one Scottish mathematician by the name of James Clerk Maxwell, and he kind of unified these things into these mathematical formularies. And basically, the important thing here to take away is that I'd say you can make an electric field by moving a magnetic field around, and conversely, you can make a magnetic field by moving an electric field or moving a current through it. And then there's another aspect here. It says there's no such thing as a magnetic monopole. And so this is really a curious thing. So even in the world of electricity and magnetism, we must have duality. So in chapter 6 of the Gita, we talk about, pleasure and pain, fame and ignominy, hot and cold, all these dualities. Well, it turns out even in the world of electromagnetism, a single North Pole cannot exist without an accompanying South Pole. They always show up together. So a magnetic monopole is impossible mathematically, and what we've observed in physical science. So this, on the microcosm versus the macrocosm, is, I'd say, another example of how in our manifested world we have these dualities, which are an inherent part of the world that we live in. And so then chapter 6 is advising to have equanimity about those dualities. It's like, well, would we be upset that a magnet has to have a north and south pole all the time? We're not. We're not bothered about that. But yet we can be bothered about being rich or poor. We can be bothered about being happy or sad, unless we take lithium. We can be bothered about all kinds of things. So this self-magnetization is to adjust your thinking so that you're not perturbed by the concrete, inherent reality of the structure of the world that we live in, that these pairs of opposites must coexist. Now this diagram here is some physics stuff. So this little hand here is showing that if you move an electric current through a wire or something, you'll generate a magnetic field. And then it works the other way around too, that if you generate a magnetic field, you can, if you move an electric magnetic field through some wires, then you'll generate a current, an electrical current. So those two things go together. And then here's a nice little quote about Maxwell and his equations. The formulation of these equations is the most important event in physics since Newton's time. not only because of their wealth of content, but because they form a pattern for a new type of law. Maxwell's equations are laws representing the structure of the field. All space is the scene of these laws, and not, as for mechanical laws, only points on which the matter or charges are present. And after that, there's this weird thing I've been puzzling on since I first got seriously into the secret doctrine only a few years ago. I've been, before that, reading, let me go back. I've been reading theosophical manuals describing theosophy, but now I'm getting into the meat and potatoes of it. And that's the idea of light. What is light? Well, light we think of as photons. And photons in physics are these massless particles. I would say, well, what's that? Like angels dancing on the head of a pin, except now it's modern Caltech science and MIT science that we can talk about massless particles and make fun of medieval mystics and scholastics talking about angels on the head of a pin. So we have that kind of funny thing about life and physics and whatnot. But a photon is a tiny particle, sometimes, that comprises waves of electromagnetic radiation. So all that Maxwell stuff is about electromagnetism. And as shown by this Maxwell physicist guy in the 1800s, late 1800s, around 1900, photons are just electric fields traveling through space. And you say, what's a field? Well, a field is like an area of influence or power or something like that. It's like an emanation, which is a very Gnostic kind of thought. Photons have no charge, they have no resting mass, and they travel at the speed of light. Photons are emitted by the action of charged particles. They can also be emitted by other methods, including radioactive decay. So what that means is when an atom, a big atom like uranium, breaks into two smaller atoms, lead and something else, then some energy is released, and the two resulting atoms of radioactive decay don't equal the mass of the uranium atom. They're equal to two. The sum is not equal. And what happens is that the missing mass is turned into the energy of the photon. And that's been known for ages, well, for decades, we'll say. And the other thing that really proves this thing about photons and radioactive decay is, last month was August when we had the anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the first time that atomic weapons were used in a war. Actually, the first and only time that we did that here in the U.S. Some national karma we have got to work out someday. But what they proved from a physics standpoint is that the mass of the uranium in the bombs, the atomic bombs in Japan, were converted to light energy and other electromagnetic radiation energy in the form of photons. So there we had this equation of this conservation of mass and energy. So together they stay equal. And just lately it's been shown in linear accelerators and other sorts of things that you can pour energy into these systems, or a cyclotron, or the one that's in Europe, CERN, where they're looking at bosons and the God particle and all that fancy science stuff that I barely understand that. It's possible to put energy in and then create matter. And then this year, 2021, some scientists were able to use a high-powered, very fancy laser. So it's photons or light or electromagnetic radiation in the light category. And they were able to create particles. So that's fascinating. And in some of the secret doctrine, Blavatsky talks about some really esoteric and strange sounding stuff about particles and matter. But light is a very important part of that. And the curious thing is this statement, and that they travel at the speed of light. And let me go to the next picture here. So that's about where'd my mouse go? Lost my mouse. It's about 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second, or I memorized that as 186,000 miles per second. So it's traveling pretty fast, these photons. And they're described as energy packets, and they're connected to this electromagnetic radiation. And as we're talking about magnetization and self-magnetization, that's why I'm delving deep into this electromagnetic stuff. It's like, what is that? And that light is a part of that, and photons are a part of that. And the fact that the photons do not accelerate, which is really weird. So if you think of your car as a thing, and you're at a stoplight, you're going 0 miles per hour, and then the light turns green and you start moving. So you slowly accelerate to the speed you're going to move at. And most everything else in the physical world does that. except for photons. They start traveling at the speed of light. They don't slow down, generally speaking. If you have empty vacuum space, you can put other things in space that will slow them down a little bit, but negligible amounts. And depending on how fast you're traveling, the speed of light is constant, and that was part of Einstein's work. So it occurred to me that in reading Blavatsky and thinking about those things now, decades later, after learning about Einstein, then a few years ago getting into the secret doctrine, is that light is something that really seems to come from another dimension of reality. And so as we talk about this obligatory pilgrimage and this self-magnetization of getting the lower to be aligned with the higher and the higher to the lower, something as ordinary and everyday as photons and light seems to be demonstrating that to us on an ongoing basis. So photons in color. So, we're used to seeing with our eyes. Now, of course, the electromagnetic spectrum that we see with our eyes is a very tiny piece of it. It goes down to, microwaves like in the kitchen, or X-rays at the doctor's office, or gamma rays, from the sun or some high energy thing going on. And then at the other end, they go to the thing that snakes see, that red, infrared, that snakes can detect that. Maybe soldiers with night vision goggles, they can see infrared, so they can see heat and see if there's a body out there of some enemy when they put those special infrared glasses on. And then it gets to bigger and bigger wavelengths and less energetic photons. Radio, so like our AM radio, FM radio, that sort of thing, radio telescopes. And there's really, really big waves. And so the photon actually doesn't have a color of its own. And what we see of as the light is the wavelength of the photons. And so from the red, the Roy G. Biv colors, the red, yellow, green, how does it get? ROY, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. So the 7 colors as defined by that cute little Roy G. Biv thing are just a tiny piece of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can detect with our eyeballs. And curiously, from my Bible days, there's this quote, and the Lord said, "Let there be light." And, for me, in part of the secret doctrine, Blavatsky mentions, let's see if I can get the words right, flames and another kind of aeon. So in this hierarchy of things like Dhyani Chohan's, there are these emanated beings at a higher level of reality. The divine light is manifested through flames, and I didn't put down the other name. But these beings could be part of what, in the Bible, it kind of hints at, let there be light. So then electromagnetic reality was created, and with that, dualities of north and south magnetic poles and all the other dualities that we see in the world. And so there's this sense of this hierarchy of things in the world. And space and time are connected to that. So space and time and electromagnetism and matter and energy, in my mind, in the world of physics, are intimately connected with each other. And why do I say that? Some of the experiments after Albert Einstein showed that the gravity of the sun is able to distort the shape of space. And some astronomers were looking for a star during a total eclipse of the sun by the moon, and they were able to demonstrate in 1945 that this star seemed to move into the wrong part of space. It was in a different place. Where it should have been behind the sun, it was actually beside the sun. And that's because the rays of light from the star were bent. In a sense, you might say space was bent around the sun. And that's very curious. And just the way that these things are interchangeable, like I was saying earlier with electromagnetism, that a current moving through a wire generates a magnetic field, and then a magnetic field that's moving around a wire will generate an electric current. So similarly, space and time and matter are connected. So if you take flat space and you bend it, you would create matter or energy. And then again, with the atomic bomb thing, matter and energy are interchangeable. So those 4 things, space and time and matter and energy, that we experience here on the physical level are intimately connected as one thing. So here's another quote about light and electromagnetism. And then I don't know where my mouse went. My mouse is hiding on me here. So not a living thing on earth lacks a germ of good, a spark of truth, a ray of supernatural light. Nothing could survive in the realm of form apart from this essential element of universal light energy, which makes cohesion possible. But this same law of balance also decrees the dispersion of life atoms, providing for decay and death as well as for birth and growth. Hence, permits not only rebirth, but also regeneration or retrogression. Let me see if I can stop sharing for a minute and come back to sharing because I lost my mouse. I'm going to get my mouse back again here. All right, there we are. So I was moving the pictures of us around so I could see the quotes here. Oops, and then the next one here is in this abhyasa concept and achieving self-magnetization through meditational practices. We have this quote here. After a long period of preparatory discipline, the neophyte, that'd be us, reaches repose, wherein it is meaningful to ask whether and in what sense there is any essential difference between such fundamental conceptions as space, causality, time, and motion. Are they merely conceptually interdependent facets of a single reality, or are they ontologically separate? So this is what I was getting to just a moment ago, that as you continue with these practices, these thoughts or realities or perceptions may occur to you. And in the Raghavan Iyer article, there's talk about having these direct experiences of this stuff. And in chapter 11 of the Gita, Arjuna is given, spiritual eyes and vision and has a direct experience. So it's not like something you read about in a book, you think about it, or you have faith that it exists, but it's an experiential thing. And so I believe that through the meditational practices, you can come to see some of this, like Albert Einstein did, this strange kind of interconnection of the, three-dimensional space, time, causality is, you do like karma, that kind of causality, time and motion. And there's a lot of talk about, the motionless motion that exists on higher levels of reality that Blavatsky talks about. So back to the practice idea. In verse 11, which I have hidden from myself somewhere, there's talk about using the kusa grass. So here's a picture of some of the grass in its native form, and here's a botanical picture, and then here's a mat made of kusa grass. And I didn't get the deer pelt, but that's another thing too that goes on with this. And curiously enough, the idea that this kusa grass and the pelt form a kind of a special magnetic thing is a fascinating concept to me. I have not looked into that for today, unfortunately. I thought I wanted to, but I didn't get time to do that. But curiously enough, there's this German fellow, Wilhelm Reich, who invented these orgone boxes. He made these boxes, and he claims to have discovered this life force energy, which he has named orgone, and basically creates these wooden boxes and puts some fur in them, and your person sits in there and it collects this life force energy. In a sense, it's kind of like this idea of today's topic of self-magnetization. His idea is that this, what's most likely going to be pranic energy, will leak out of a person, or your barriers around you will let it dissipate more readily than not. And the orgone box was to help accumulate that energy so that you could kind of breathe it back in or reabsorb it into your body. So similarly, I think in verse 11 of chapter 6 of the Gita, this little equation here of the kusa grass, the deer pelt, the cloth, and you're sitting on that, is in a sense like the orgone box. So it's my hypothesis, without knowing, that Wilhelm Reich just copied the Gita and some of these Hindu and other Eastern practices with the kusa grass and the deer pelt, and then gave it his own branding and tried to make some money off of it. Unfortunately, if any of you know about Wilhelm Reich, the United States FDA, Federal Drug Administration, thought that this was all nonsense, and they told him to stop doing this, but he persisted in selling these things, and he got caught for interstate commerce violations and was put in prison for selling these orgone boxes. So be careful what you do with your kusa grass, what claims you're making about it. But I think it's a similar thing. So what about this magnetization of the self that we do with meditation. You know, Crosby in the ULT here, Crosby talks about thoughts and the patterns of thought that we have. And again, in chapter 6 of the Gita, there's all this talk about, you know, the equanimity, but also having a kind of a compassionate thing and a compassionate mindset. And in Buddhism too, you know, there's this idea that we want good things for all sentient beings. So what's going on with thought? Well, you know, here on the physical world and in the mechanistic, reductionistic science world, we think of our brain as the source of our thoughts. And indeed, because of the microcosm, macrocosm, and this septenary nature of things, you know, down on the physical level here, we are into our brains. Now, you know, earlier I was giving you all this seemingly boring stuff about electricity and magnetism. Well, guess what? As many of you know, there's this thing called electrophysiology, and you might have seen people with those, you know, little electrodes glued to their scalp, the electroencephalogram that neurologists use. So basically, nerves of all the animals, including us humans, use two minerals, sodium, which is like lithium, sodium and potassium, and they interchange from each other. There's a pump that makes a gradient, so one will be higher on one side and lower on the other side. So it's not in balance. They're out of balance. But because of that out of balance thing, they create a net electrical charge. And it's just really amazing. And so these electrical charges will travel across a nerve. And it'll be this imbalanced thing that'll just go through these pumps and through these ion channels of sodium and potassium. And sodium, as you may remember, is just ordinary table salt. And anyone who has hypertension or high blood pressure knows you got to limit your salt. Well, you limit it, but you don't eliminate it, because salt is absolutely necessary. This Na is sodium, this you know, the chemical symbol of sodium. The K is the symbol for potassium. And at the drugstore and whatnot, Walmart, other places, you can get the salt seasoning that has no sodium in it, and it's made of potassium. So you get potassium salts to put on your food to make them salty. Excuse me. So those are very similar atoms to each other, but they're essential for the function of our neurons. And for us as higher animals, Homo sapiens, our species, we use that. And it's all of our nerves, our central nervous system nerves. There's 12 cranial nerves that actually, they cheat and they don't go to the spinal cord. They go directly to the brain. The big one of those is nerve 10, the vagus. It goes from the brain to the heart to the gut, and that's where we get that gut feeling in our body. You might say there's chakras aligned across the cranial nerve 10, the vagus. Our heart and every single muscle uses this sodium potassium stuff, and it goes all the way down to sea slugs, and they use sodium and potassium too in their neurons. One thing that scientists will study in the lab are giant squid axons. So the giant squids have really big nerves, and that they're big enough you can poke little needles in them. And actually some neurologists will put little needles in humans too, in your arms, or they'll put stuff, if they open up your skull, put stuff in your brain and measure electrical activity that way. Nerve conduction velocities, there's different pathologies with that. So it's a fascinating thing that there's electricity in our body. And as we heard, as electricity is moving, it generates a magnetic field. And so you might say, oh, okay, so the action of our nervous system is generating a magnetic field. And as we talk about self-magnetization, is that related somehow? Question mark. I think it is. Here in this green, there's just a simpler picture of the sodium-potassium pump. It uses adenosine triphosphate, or ADP, or ATP, adenosine triphosphate, gets used, and then it's broken down to adenosine diphosphate plus it's missing in the picture here, but one phosphate little moiety, or little collection of atoms. And that generates some energy that enables this pump to do its pumping work. And this other picture up here at the top, it's hard to read all these words. Let me see if I can get my pictures out of the way. It's a rock called magnetite. So it's 3 irons and 4 oxygens. So it's really simple. Just 2 atoms, iron and O2, iron and oxygen, 3 irons and 4 oxygens. And it forms a crystal, believe it or not. And it's like a magnet, you might say, like regular iron, like those simple north-south magnets I was showing earlier today. And this magnetite rock, it is one of the oxides of iron. It's ferromagnetic. It can be attracted to a magnet. It can also be magnetized, and it can become a permanent magnet itself. And it's the most magnetic of all naturally occurring minerals on Earth. So this magnetite, this Fe3O4 stuff, is pretty significant. And interestingly, if we say it can become magnetized, that's significant because in 1995, let me see what I got on the next picture here. It was discovered that magnetite exists in human brains. It's like, what? I never knew that from my medical school days in 1981. I didn't know about magnetite or that it was in human brains, but years later, in 1995, it was discovered. And let me read this. Although it has long been known, since 1995, that magnetite can be formed biochemically by bacteria, protists, and other living organisms. Oh, that's the ancient knowledge. It's only in the last 25 years, since 95, that magnetite has been discovered to be present in our own human brains. So researchers have documented the presence of magnetite nanocrystals, meaning little teeny crystals, in the human brain. It's in a couple of different regions of the brain, and they use things like the CAT scans, the magnetic tomography methods, and transmission electron microscopy to look at these little crystals. To understand the mechanism behind the formation of these in the human brains, the authors of this little abstract, they took some approach studying magnetite biomineralization in other species and geochemical research. And they looked at that and they give some reports in their article, which I have cut that out here. And this is the punchline here. Regular Western scientists and neurologists and neurophysiologists and all these researchers, they do not know the exact role of magnetite nanocrystals in human brain physiology, yet to be determined. Well, I think that we know from verse 11 and chapter 6 of the Gita, that we know that we can self-magnetize through the habits of our thoughts. Now, at the beginning of this earth, and we talk about cyclical this and that, and the pralaya and the mamantara, and traveling through the different planets, and after the devachanic state between incarnations. So there's this beginning, middle, and end of things. And in Earth, at the beginning of primitive Earth, there was not a whole lot of oxygen. And so there were some early bacteria. This is a little picture of one of these guys that has these little black dots in it. The black dots are magnetite. That Fe3O4, that little crystal rock, is in these bacteria. So these are very primitive, ancient bacteria. And they're able to detect, with this string of magnetite, the magnetic fields of the Earth. So in that earlier picture of showing the yellow lines around the planet Earth, they can detect magnetic fields, and they use them like their very own GPS. So we think we are all modern with our fancy new cars that have GPS in them, but these primitive ancient bacteria, just like Blavatsky says, from the atoms to the lower animals, the plant world, and us up to the human world, and then to other levels of reality, there's similar things going on, and we all have this amazing emanation within us. So here's an example from regular biology and science that there are these ancient bacteria that use the magnetic fields of the Earth. And it turns out they live in water and liquids. So they prefer lower oxygen areas. So they like to go to brackish water that's not well oxygenated. And so they use the magnetic fields to go that way. And the field strength actually gets a little less when there's more crud and dirt in the water, so they like that, and they'll go in that direction because they live better that way. Now, one of the things in this search for equanimity, and this search to be magnetized, and this search to align the lower self with the higher self, in the Gita, there's one of the you might say observations and complaints or objections that Arjuna has. And here's the William Quan Judge translation of verse 34. For the mind is very fickle, O Krishna. It is impetuous, strong, and obstinate. I think it is difficult. It is as difficult to control as the wind. Now, in that little YouTube video, I was showing you the seemingly chaotic magnetic fields of our sun. It's like, okay, so if we're in this microcosm, macrocosm thing, there is going to be some idea that a lot of movement and activity is part of reality. And so it's interesting that Arjuna says these thoughts are like the wind. They're just chaotic and moving around. Now on this um, uh, the next couple verses, Krishna reassures Arjuna that with practice and diligence, we can get control. And in the Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky, and I didn't put the quote in here, but I was looking at it this last couple days. She talks about the distinction between thought or brain chatter and ideation as something that one would develop a skill for ideation through meditational practices and through these mind control, through this yoga. And in this case, this is a particular kind of yoga in chapter 6. It's this yoga of meditation. And I'm looking at my notes here. They're in my other notes, but they're behind the screen. I can't find them. The Sanskrit word eludes me at the moment. But anyway, this particular kind of meditational yoga is what we're talking about. And she says that it's through that not kind of chaotic brain thinking, but this more ideational thinking that we can come to that inner peace and equanimity. And why do I have this secret doctrine here? Oh, it looks like I put the wrong quote in this slide. Let me go to the next one. Yeah, okay. So these were from the opening quotes at the beginning of the Hermes article. So in the first one, I just kind of go back to the very beginning of the presentation where Blavatsky says in all the different levels of life and beings, you know, even going down to the rock and mineral level, there's these atoms that the world is made out of. There are these realities in basic plants. You might say the algae, the vegetable world, the simple animal world, starting from ancient bacteria like we saw a moment ago to other animals and higher animals. And then we get to the more complicated animals and the primates like us and mammals and that sort of thing. And then we can go beyond that into these other entities and beings, these devas, if you will. And we have that journey that is in the Pistis Sophia, that upward journey and that downward journey, and that the capital S self can align with the lower S self, the little s self. But if we focus with that two-formed manas too much on the physical and the objects of the senses, we can get an antagonistic relationship between the higher self and the lower self, and that will result in some difficulties, you might say, or some bad karma. And who knows, that may even be what's behind the manic depressive illness that I was talking about earlier with that Dr. Cage and lithium treatment, where you're caught in the winds of rage and caught in the winds of giddy elation. You're going back and forth with all these objects of the self and emotions, even though in bipolar disorder, it's really independent from external reality, but still you're reacting that way. And that the big goal is then to align these two, and you might say that alignment is in fact the self-magnetization, where we have that renunciation of the self, that mortification of the ego, if you will. And we're able to align with the self and then have these more transcendental, mystical experiences of the unity of all things. And in this second part of the Secret Doctrine quote from Volume 1, the first part I didn't put it on the slide correctly. This is the second part of that quote. The same of this beginning and ending this Manvantara, creation, destruction, the same for the universe, which manifests periodically for purposes of the collective progress of the countless lives, the outbreathing of the one life, in order that through the ever-becoming, every cosmic atom in this infinite universe, passing from the formless and the intangible through the mixed natures of the semi-terrestrial down to matter in full generation, and then back again, reascending at each new period higher and nearer the final goal, that each atom we say may reach through individual merits and efforts that plane where it re-becomes the unconditioned all. So for me, just to backtrack a moment here, this idea of the universe passing from the formless and intangible down to matter in full generation. So what is formless and intangible? You might say that's spirit on the one hand, or you might say it's the curvature of space-time, or you might say it's an electromagnetic field, and then from that you can generate particles or matter. And one thing that the subatomic physicists back in the 1920s and 30s came up with the idea theoretically, and then it's been observed in decades since, is that at this very deep subatomic level, there is this constant creation and destruction, this of particle-antiparticle pairs. So like an electron and a positron, those two little things, they'll, out of a field of space where there's energy in it, they will just pop into existence. But then, because they're antiparticles to each other, they will kind of come into existence, and then they'll find each other because they're attracted like magnetically, attraction north and south, and then they'll annihilate each other and then turn back to energy, keeping that equation that matter and energy are always equal in our manifested universe. So here we have in Blavatsky's writing, passing from the formless and the intangible through mixed natures of the semi-terrestrial down to matter in full generation. So this has been seen in modern Western scientific physics, these particle-antiparticle pairs coming into existence and going out of existence. And then I was mentioning earlier this research that I heard about, that this year some physicists were able to use high-energy lasers to create subatomic particles. So with that, I will close up this part of the presentation and open up for any questions or comments, especially any clarification questions, as I talked about a bunch of weird stuff on this idea of self-magnetization.
I have a thought, Ken, might be of interest to you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you now.
Okay. In 0607, UCLA, in the fMRI labs, Alan Shore, who wrote Affect Regulation and Affect Dysregulation, the 2-volume book, there were studies there that on lithium orotate, which is a natural form of lithium. And they found that when you were taking doses of this natural lithium orotate, it increased the mass of the frontal lobe by about 20%. And since you were talking about electromagnetic light and then matter being created, I thought here's very interesting that when you add this natural form of lithium, which they're no longer allowed to health food stores sell more than 5 milligram units of the lithium, and it doesn't have any side effects. As soon as people stopped taking the lithium orotate, guess what? The mass also was reduced. And in diseases like Lyme disease, that is frontotemporal and syphilis, and probably the viruses too, you actually lose, the mass of your frontal lobe, but you can create it chemically. So I thought that would be apropos and an application of what you were saying. But there are other hands that are up. I think I see Jonathan. Did you have a thought, or is that not true?
I do. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. Well, gosh, Ken, thank you so much. That was really a fine presentation. And you really are good at explaining science. I have a question about this analogy thing with electricity and magnetism and the interrelationship that you can produce one from the other. And I was wondering, and then you said in several different ways that our thought can kind of transform our environment, it seems. If the thought is like a current, is the environment like the magnetic field around us? And I was wondering if you could kind of explore that a little bit.
Yes, Jonathan, thanks for asking that, because I did want to amplify and sort of make the conclusion of 2 + 2 is 4, but I never got to the 4 part. So the idea is that, as Crosby was saying, if we keep certain thoughts in our mind, and in chapter 6 we want to keep certain thoughts in our minds, that's going to be along our neurons. But because of this electricity and magnetism stuff, and the fact that there's magnetite, nanoparticles, little crystals in our brain somewhere. It could be that we can magnetize the magnetite crystals in our own brain and thus achieve a kind of self-magnetization of our brains, or at least of the magnetite in our brains, and that will, in a sense, maybe support back and forth the neural activity of our thought processes, our cognitions, with some of the physical structure of our actual brains. And so that's how I was thinking that the magnetite, this Fe3O4 compound that's in these primitive ancient bacteria, but also in our brains, can have some role in sort of, you might say, a concrete physical level microcosm of the macrocosm of the self-magnetization. Helen, I see Maluka's hand.
Please go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Ken. That was so amazing. And all the different angles that you presented, I enjoy very much. The philosophical and then the scientific. I was wondering, there is a thought, and it's in our teachings, that human doesn't supposed to have pets indoors. They kind of recommend that outdoors because of the animal magnetism. And apparently that when you are in certain level, you're supposed to be in touch with that. But at the same time, I have a pet and I know about it, and I know a lot of us have pets because, they're losing the habitat and we're trying to save them too. But at the same time, I know theosophists that they don't like to touch animals. They don't like to even touch people because of that. But then they eat meat. And I'm wondering, you don't touch people, animals, but then you eat them, which is worse. And also, Thanksgiving is coming up in another month, a couple of months. And what they do is terrible to those poor turkeys. And I think we have reached a point in our time that maybe we should consider discussing this kind of thing. What are your thoughts?
Yes, that's fascinating. I was thinking about somehow bringing the French guy Anton Mesmer into this conversation today, but I just couldn't quite get together and figure out how does Anton Mesmer and hypnosis come into play, because it was thought that what he was doing in Paris in the 1800s was using animal magnetism between himself as the human guy and then his hypnosis subjects. So if there is this possibility of alignment, and I believe that it is true that perhaps some of the theosophists don't want little pet animals, a dog or a cat, around because it might lower their own, ascending path. But given that this is a cyclical ascent and descent that Gene Jennings was talking about, it could be okay to have the animals around. But indeed, what we're doing, in a sense, to kind of counterbalance that is putting ourselves together with other human theosophists who are working on the ascent path, and then we can take time out and relax and chill with our little pet animals, because we are actually living in these animal bodies, these Homo sapiens, our species bodies that we're in, the vehicle in this seventh level of reality. The other thing about eating animals, I was just talking about and listening to some things about integrity. And integrity and these ethical principles are somewhat culture bound. For instance, here in the U.S., we venerate our little pet dogs. We might take them to the special dog doctor, the veterinarian. We have food for them, and then we have special rituals when they pass away, and we maybe put them in a pet cemetery. On the other hand, in mainland China, it's estimated they consume about 10 to 20 million dogs per year. And that's totally normal, and they're in complete integrity with that sort of dietary use of dogs. But here we don't. We're sort of abhorred by that. So it's a very situational thing. And I think with the equanimity of chapter 6, it's like, yeah, we see this. Different things happen, different people do different things, and it's just what it is,
Pythagoras used to say that he remembered being a dog, and all animals have a soul, and they deserve the chance to be in this world too.
Yes, and
David has his hand up.
David, yeah.
Hi. Oh yeah, I had a thought. I think you were talking about magnetism and the laws of nature and opposites attracting. Could you say something about? I've heard it said that on the physical plane opposites attract, but on the mental plane like attracts like. So there's kind of the laws working in a different way on the mental plane. In relation to meditation, etc. Maybe you could make a comment about that.
Yes. Oh, thank you, David. That's an interesting sort of paradox, you might say. And then it's like, well, what is the like that we're talking about? And what is the opposite that we're talking about? So in a sense, you might say that the opposites are going to be that concrete example of the simple, bar magnet, north and south. So we'll have the opposites attracting there in a very physical, simplistic, magnetic level. But then at another level, just like us here today, we're attracted to each other because of being alike in some way. And that it would be our pursuits. And then different groups of people, say like in a university, the professors all in the one department, they're going to be alike to each other and kind of hanging out together. People at the golf course are going to have certain values, and likes and dislikes are going to hang out together. And there is this curious thing. So I think it's probably not quite the same as the north and south magnetic pole opposites attracting, but it's a different level of attraction. And that these individual, like us theosophists or individual golfers, it's not that they're opposite of each other, because each one in his own individuality has the opposites within him or her, but as a group, there's the fact that they're magnets together and they have their north and south. They like to hang out with other magnets, like they say, birds of a feather flock together.
I have a question, Ken. I'm sorry, was there somebody else? Go ahead, David.
Oh, no, I was just going to add the one thought I had around that too is, because you were talking about meditation, is that when we want to learn something, if we hold an idea long enough and meditated on long enough, we draw more knowledge about that idea. So we're kind of like attracting like. No, I mean, would you say that holds up?
Yes. That does make sense in that regard.
I have a question. It looks like the magnetite is in the heaviest concentrations in the cerebellum and the brainstem. Why do you think, esoterically, what does that connect us to?
Yes, well, the cerebellum has to do a lot with motor activity and controlling the fine motions of motor. So if, say, I'm pointing to my camera, if you have cerebellar damage, you can't point right, and you kind of do this jiggly pointing. So that's part of the cerebellum. Cerebellum is very stereotyped in its functions. That's one thing for that. So it could be related to motion and activity. The brainstem, however, has to do with something that over the decades I've heard of called the reticular activating system is in the brainstem. Also, it's part of a conduit of all the peripheral nerves coming into the brain, except for those special 12 cranial nerves. So in a sense, it's like a gateway, the brainstem. And also the reticular activating system is for our awareness. And as we talk about, these ideas of meditation, we want to work on our awareness, our capacity for attention and witness consciousness, if you will. And I think having the magnetite in the brainstem, because I wasn't sure where it was, hadn't gone that far in my reading about it in the brain. So that's fascinating that you found that, Helen. So it could be that it's helping with that gateway function on the one hand, but then also assisting with the development of the witness consciousness, the conscious awake awareness that the reticular activating system provides in the brain.
Well,
it looks like we have Minuka there.
Luca and David, whoever wants to go first.
Well, I was just, go ahead, Maluka, sure.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Unless somebody else had a question, it was just a lull there. So I thought I'd throw something out. We talked a lot about light tonight. I mean, you did. You brought out some really interesting things. But in relation to duality, could you say something about how the idea of darkness relates to light, on a philosophical level, maybe?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Darkness is really, really curious and fascinating. I'm not sure I have a really good answer about that. But the idea that if you go back to, say, Albert Einstein, you have, I guess, what is it? A special relativity. He postulates empty space. So there's just space with nothing in it, space-time. So we got this four-dimensional field of nothing. You might say, well, that's dark. And then even in the Bible, there's this sense of there's a nothingness before emanation, and that could be the night of Brahman in the Pralaya and Manvantara aspect. So the darkness is that nothingness, and then things appear. Then we have the day of Brahman, and that's when in the Bible it says, "Let there be light," and then we have these emanations of the aeons and the other higher order beings in the Gnostic ideas that are beings of light, and that they come into manifestation. And in a sense, why I was tying it to James Clerk Maxwell is to say that maybe that early manifestation is the creation of, or the emanation of, electromagnetism, with all the things that go with electromagnetism. The particle-antiparticle pairs, the photons, the light, electricity, and magnetism, they're all kind of linked together. And so for me, that would be the distinction between light and dark in a physical way. And then the philosophical thing is curious, because we think about, especially in the Christian world, of light is good and dark is evil. And I think those could be culture bound, just like the Chinese eating 10 million dogs. I think those are culture bound things for us Western Christians in the last 2,000 years. But I'm not sure about that. But there is certainly that very, very ancient, I think our species has been around for close to 300 million years. Although about 65 million years ago, something changed, and then we got more language, and about some other recent time, no, not million, 300,000. I'm sorry, 300,000 years. And then 65,000 years ago, something happened to our species. But what's been noticed for us and other creatures and animals too is that diurnal cycle of the sun revolving, the earth revolving. We have night and day. And so there's different things in the light and different things in the dark. And so we have all this mythology and all these realities about that duality of night and day.
Maluka?
Yes. I was thinking that I read that HPV said that the Earth have only one moon, and we know why, right? But also she said that doesn't have enough magnetism to attract any other moons. And she said because there is so much things in Earth, so much horrible things committed, that the planet, one is being us destroying it, we also destroying it. So they lose a lot of magnetism. And I was wondering, two, if there is a solution for that, and two, can that apply to us too as humans?
Yes, here on I think the geologist folks will tell us that the when a volcano explodes, you get that lava. So on the inside of the Earth, there's this liquid rock,
Iron.
the magma, and it's just circulating around. So something's keeping that circulating, and that's what's generating the magnetic field, is the movement of these charged particles. And because there's no such thing as perpetual motion, you might postulate, well, that magnet's probably going to slow down and maybe stop someday, and then we won't have any magnetic field at all. And then the question is, can that happen to a human being? And I think it happens in every one of our individual, birth, middle, age, death. Because then when we're dead, there's no more there's no more neural activity. They say, the brain dead, all these laws and things about it. Are they brain dead or not brain dead? So are our nerves doing anything in the brain? But clearly, if we're still breathing and whatnot, some of the nerves are doing something. But when there's the complete death, then there's not even that electrical activity of the nervous system, and then there'll be no more magnetism of the body either on a concrete level. And then you might say the spiritual dimensions of that are going to be the consciousness and our spiritual aspects in this septenary nature, and that I would say, yeah, it is possible for that to dissipate as well. But then it's like, because the theosophical teachings say that this reincarnating part of us is different. So it could be that the magnetization of the physical body is at this lower vesture, but that the higher one will continue to keep, as is promised to us in our tenets, it will keep that karmic balance as we go through the cycle of devachan and reincarnation.
And we have in our chat room a wonderful quote from Laura. Maybe we could end on this note. This is
Yes, it is a quote from Mr. Judge. Would you like
from
me to
Mr.
read
Judge. Sure, I'd love for you. Thank you, Laura.
If we do all our acts, small and great, every moment for the sake of the whole human race as representing the Supreme Self, then every cell and fiber of the body and inner man will be turned or magnetized, using tonight's term, in one direction, resulting in perfect consciousness.
Wow, that's terrific. Well, thank you, Ken, very much, and everybody who participated. Great to see you all, and enjoy the rest of your evening, and happy self-magnetization.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Good night.
Good night.